Hi everyone, my name is Adrian Fraser. I'm a postdoc at UC Santa Cruz working with Pascal Goro on right now MHD effects on fingering convection in stars. Also interested in shear flows quite generally, but particularly in stars. Really, instability-driven turbulence is great. That's the kind of stuff that I study. Um, I'm going to talk to you about that fingering convection issue that I'm working on right now. That motivates at least one of the research projects that I propose to work on here. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to meet to talk about it. I'm excited to be participating this year. I've never participated in this program before, so I'm really looking forward to meeting you all virtually and working on some cool stuff. Let's see if I can share my screen. All right. I suppose with this format, I can't ask you all if you see my screen, but I see it, so let's go. So I'm reusing slides from a talk that I gave recently, so hope that's all right. So what is fingering convection, also known as thermohaline mixing? It's a instability that occurs when you have opposing temperature and concentration gradients, like chemical concentration of some solute. So it was originally studied quite a bit in oceans, where if you have a stabilizing temperature gradient, so warm water over cold water, and a destabilizing salinity gradient or salt concentration gradient. So you have saltier water over fresh water, which is denser. Salt water is denser, but you have a more steeper temperature gradient, right? So the heat generally wants to cause the fluid to expand and decrease its density. So you have on top here fluid that is a little bit lighter because of the excess heat, a little bit heavier because of the excess salt. And we're looking at a parameter regime where the temperature gradient wins. So overall, the fluid on top is lighter than the fluid on bottom, despite the salinity gradient. And because of that, you don't have Rayleigh-Taylor instability or Rayleigh-Bernard convection. You don't have any overturning convection because you have a lighter fluid over a heavier fluid. However, you can still get what's known as the fingering instability if you take into account the very different diffusion coefficients that heat and here salt have. And I should note that this is a stellar astrophysics program. Why are we talking about oceans when we should be talking about stars? And this is because the same instability is thought to exist in stars, but instead of salts, think of it as metals of some kind or anything heavier than hydrogen. So instead of a gradient of salinity, it's a gradient of mean molecular weight that's driving the sort of second effect in addition to temperature here. Anyway, and in that case, note that the diffusion of heat is much faster than the diffusion of metals in some stars. So the same instability mechanism can exist. And what is that instability mechanism? Well, if you imagine taking a warm, salty parcel of fluid from the top part of the domain and displacing it downwards, it is initially lighter than its surroundings, right? Because it's so much warmer. However, because heat diffuses so rapidly, it very quickly becomes at equal temperature to the surroundings, but it still has a larger concentration of salt. That means that it is no longer lighter than the surroundings. Instead, it is now denser than the surroundings, and it will buoyantly sink. So this shows that through a combination of these two competing gradients of the potential temperature and solute concentration and the disparate diffusivities, we can get a weird little diffusive instability or double diffusive instability in a parameter regime where we don't have any ordinary convective instabilities, right? Because again, the top half here is lighter than the bottom half. I want to note that the free energy source for this instability is all these salt particles or metals that have gravitational potential energy and want to drift downwards. So if you crank up the concentration gradient or the mean molecular weight gradient, increase the concentration of these dots here, that's going to add to the free energy for this instability, and it's going to drive more instability. It's going to increase the growth rate. Why are we studying the stars? Well, there's a few different hot examples, including white dwarf and debris disks, but here we're going to talk a little bit about RGB stars. Basically, RGB stars, you got your massive convective zone here as the envelope, and you have a thin hydrogen-bearing shell with radiation zone as a buffer between the two of them, at least in certain stages of evolution. So you have a buffer zone, because you don't have any convection, you just have this radiation zone that separates this massive convection zone from the hydrogen burning shell. And so you wouldn't expect any significant mixing between the two of them, because radiation zones don't have nearly as much transport, as much turbulent mixing as convection zones. But observations of surface helium-3 abundances suggest that there is something that's driving mixing between the two. So for some reason, there's mixing between the convection zone and the hydrogen burning shell that's allowing helium-3 to transport and get burnt up. Maybe it's thermohelium mixing that's responsible. That's what authors have looked at and found pretty convincing evidence that, depending on your prescription for thermohelium mixing, or also known as fingering convection, it's the same thing. Depending on your assumptions of how efficient thermohelium mixing is for a given, system set of parameters, you are able to get MESA models to agree with observations. That was studied in these two papers here. I highly recommend them. Well, this one's one of the MESA papers, but this one here is the one that I recommend reading in particular, where prescriptions for thermohelium mixing were added to MESA, and you can see this is a Kippenhahn plot. So you can think of this axis as radius and this axis as time. Basically, you have your big convective envelope here, you have your inert helium core, and then your hydrogen burning shell here. And this buffer zone between eventually gets filled with thermohelium mixing that bridges the gap and allows helium-3 to get transported down into the hydrogen burning shell. Now, this paper, if you look at it, there's some neat figures that are basically explaining that in order to explain, in order to match up with observations, you need certain values of efficiency for thermohelium mixing given some parameters. And that's something that's not constrained well, or at least wasn't at the time, by theory. It was sort of anybody's guess how efficient thermohelium mixing was. We knew how to tell if it, I say we, I was in undergrad at the time. People knew how to identify whether there was thermohelium mixing occurring here, but nobody knew how efficient it was. Then people did some hydrodynamic simulations and basically showed, looks bad, not a lot of mixing, back to the drawing board. But as one always asks in astrophysics, what about magnetic fields? It's not the next slide, but in a few slides, I'll show you that if you add magnetic fields, maybe that can, in fact, make up for this difference, and magnetic fields can explain, allow thermohelium mixing to explain this mixing process. I've got a limited time here. I don't want to go into details about the system setup and the simulations. I'll put the slides here. I want to note that it's a local model. We're using Boussinesq approximation, and here we go. You get some nice turbulence. We're doing a bunch of DNS simulations and trying to match them to various models to see if we can see what happens in stars, what the mixing properties are like. We add magnetic fields. Sorry, I'm really trying to keep this short. Now, the one thing that I do want to show here is this is, we start our simulations with a given temperature and composition profile. We add small scale noise. This profile is unstable with thermohelium, the fingering instability. We add small scale noise to kick off the instability. And before you get this well-developed turbulence here, you first have this instability that grows, and it looks like this. This is vertical velocity in our domain. Note we have periodic boundary conditions. It's a local model, think shearing box. Here we have vertical velocity, just sort of this column moving upwards of vertical velocity. And here we have a downward moving flow. These are called elevator modes because it's sort of like elevator up, elevator down. And I want to note that this is a shear flow. We have upward moving fluid here, neutral fluid here, downward moving fluid here. This is, perfect for Kelvin-Hamilton stability, shear flow instability. And I also want to note that these are really, really small length scales. We're talking about a diffusive scale instability. So even though stars normally have, when you think of astrophysical fluid dynamics, usually you're talking really, really large Reynolds numbers. Usually you can't actually include dissipation or explicit viscosity if you want to, be at astrophysical parameters. But here we have an astrophysically motivated system with really, really small Reynolds numbers, in particular, really, really high values of resistivity because it's a low magnetic Prandtl number regime. So I think I need to cut to the chase. We really need to better understand shear flows at really strong magnetic fields and really high resistivities. And that motivates one of the two proposals, project proposals that I gave for this program. So if all of this stuff sounds interesting to you, this business of thermohelium mixing in stars is the direct motivation to one of the 2 projects that I provided. I'm going to go through these slides just fast enough for you to pause on them in case you actually want to read them. And I'm happy to answer any questions. The punchline of this talk was basically that previous models that did really well before do really, really poorly when you go to magnetic Prandtl number less than 1, which is why we need better understanding of shear flows at high values of resistivity. So yeah, thanks for your time. Looking forward to participating in this meeting and looking forward to meeting all of you. How do I get out of this? Yeah, bye.